Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Wall. I'm the Deputy Archivist of the United States. Welcome to the National Archives for today's conversation with veteran newsman Dan Rather. Over the past 60 years as a journalist, 44 of those with CBS News, Dan Rather has covered virtually every major event in the world. It's indeed an honor to have him here to talk about his long and distinguished career. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Cokie Roberts. Cokie is a political commentator for ABC News and a senior news analyst for National Public Radio. All of Cokie's books have been bestsellers, including We Are Our Mother's Daughters, Founding Mothers, and Ladies of Liberty, all histories of women in American history. And we know her very well here as a member of our foundation board and one of our biggest supporters. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cokie Roberts and Dan Rather.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Deb. Deb Wall is my friend, even though she reminded me just now that between Dan and me, we've got 100 years of journalism. It's actually probably even more than that, so let's just not go there. And welcome to the archives.
Thank you very much.
I feel like this is my home, too. I've been on this board for a very long time, and my mother was before me. So she told me I have to do it. Do what she says. She told me not to break my wrist, too. But you all know who Dan Rather is. And I'm not going to take up time with a boring introduction. You've known him all your lives in many cases, and in other cases, your adult lives at CBS News. And now he's doing wonderful work at HDTV, where you really are enjoying what you're able to do now.
I do. First of all, Cokie, thank you for doing this, and thank you everyone for being here. I really think this is I think it's the best sustained work I've ever done, and I have tremendous pleasure. I've always had a passion for covering news. I have a lot of faults and flaws, made my mistakes, but as a child, I aspired to be a reporter, and I've been lucky enough and blessed enough to live that dream.
Now, Dan, it's true. You being able to be a reporter is a great treat. I always joke that it's a license to snoop. But I have to tell you, when the archives asked me to come do this, and I was delighted to do it, I remember there was some time decades ago that you and I had some contretemps, and I couldn't remember what it was about. That's how significant it was. So I tried to remember in case somebody brought it up, and so I Googled, of course, Dan Rather, Cokie Roberts. And what came up,
I'm surprised anything came up.
No, came up over and over and over and over again was the same joke. And it says, CBS newsman Dan Rather, NPR reporter Cokie Roberts, and then the third person changes in each of the jokes. Sometimes it's Peter Jennings, sometimes it's Wolf Blitzer, sometimes, but you and I are there every time. And we're walking along in Iraq, and with a Marine, and we get captured, and we're all about to die. And the Marine says to the terrorist, before you kill us, would you please kick me in the behind? And he says, why? He says, because I don't want it to look like I've gone down without a fight. This joke was everywhere. And he said, and the guy goes behind him, and the Marine pulls out a gun and shoots him. And so you and I say to him, why didn't you do that in the first place? And he said, because I didn't want you to say that I was the terrorist. That's the joke. But I do remember a true story about you in the first Persian Gulf War, told to me by your longtime producer, Tom Batag from CBS, where you went to the war zone and the chaplain asked to meet you. Do you remember this? And the chaplain was from my home state of Louisiana. And he said he had to meet you because before he left home to go to the war zone, he was saying Mass one day, and this was in Cajun country in Louisiana, And he saw a man at the back of the church he had not seen for a very long time.
I know this story.
Remember that? You want to tell it?
No, you tell it.
and he says, after Mass, he goes over and he says, Jean-Baptiste, it's so nice to see you here at Mass, but what brought you here? And he said, Dan Rather brung me. And the priest said, Dan Rather brought you to Mass? And he said, yes, Father, Dan Rather brung me every night. He says, Christ is in the Gulf, Christ is in the Gulf. I figure any day now he's going to be in Bro Bridge.
Well told, well told.
But you know, it gets to the point that you've spent an awful lot of time in that region.
I have.
And one of the last big stories you did before the last big story was Abu Ghraib. And you discovered some real upsets with CBS News when you were doing Abu Ghraib.
Well, I did, Cokie. That we at CBS News broke on a worldwide basis the story of abuses at Abu Ghraib. We had the story, we had the photographs, we had trouble getting it on the air. And I go into some detail in the book for anybody who's interested in this. And that was in early 2004. We followed a few months later with the story of what a young George Bush did and did not do when he was supposed to be serving in the Air National Guard. I want to emphasize that less than a quarter of this book is about this period. I recognize that I couldn't write a book and not include that.
Right.
But this book is filled with the kind of stories I tell my family and tell my friends when they say, what was it like really to interview Saddam Hussein, or what was it like in Vietnam? These are the kind of stories that I tell them. But in terms of the book, I put this in the book because I knew I had to.
Well, you lead with it.
Yeah. Yes. Well, to get it out of the way, quite frankly. But it's been 8 years ago since we did Abu Ghraib and had trouble getting it on the air, and did the Bush National Guard story and caught hell about it. And perhaps in some ways we deserve to. But it's been 8 years ago, 6 years since I left CBS News. And I'm at peace with that. This is one of the most productive times of my life. I don't think about that period very often. Naturally, I did for writing the book. And what I wanted to do, having said, look, you can't write the book and not put it in, is put my side of the story in the book. There'll be people who disagree with it, people who agree with it, and some people say they don't know.
But this isn't your version of Nancy Reagan's My Turn.
No, it is not. Not. With all respect to the former First Lady.
I understand. Do you get asked about anything but the George Bush part of it?
Well, until I did this book, I almost never got asked about it. But since I did the book, I'd have to say that most of the questions start off with that, and some of them don't go any further than that. Mm-hmm. But there's no complaint about that. I'm a pro, and if people want to talk about it, but I talk about it, mostly refer to the book, but talk about it as much as I feel is appropriate. But again, that I'm aware that it's been a long time ago, and for a lot of people, they say, why should I care about this? And the answer is probably not, except what it tells you about how modern journalism, American journalism, operates at the top, really how it operates, as opposed to how it may appear that it operates. And why most people should care, other than journalists, is because we all agree, we know somewhere deep down in our id, that a free press, an independent, fiercely independent, when necessary press, is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. And the press's role, when we're at our best, one of our most important roles is to serve as a check and balance on power. And that's a thread that is woven through the book, not just in the Abu Ghraib and Bush National Guard stories, but throughout the book.
And the one other thing, and I do want to talk about the rest of the book because it's fun, but you do make an important and serious charge, which is basically that Sumner Redstone, the head of Viacom, wanted George Bush to be reelected president.
Well, he said he wanted it.
And that was really the reason that this came down the way it did.
That's right. In short, that's right. And I think the record shows that Mr. Redstone, who owns Viacom, which owns CBS News, said, listen, I want George Bush to be reelected. We ran this story. In a Texas phrase, he blew a gasket. And that reverberated down through the news division with the results that we all now know.
And you think that was fundamentally it?
I do. At base, fundamentally, that was it.
And you say at one point in the book, and I was struck by it because, of course, you're talking at this point about the whole internal investigation with Dick Thornburgh heading it, of course, a former Bush administration, Bush 1 official and former Republican governor of Pennsylvania, that you thought the fix was in on that investigation. And you said at one point they put their hands firmly, CBS seemed to have placed its finger firmly on the Republican side of the scale. And it struck me because, of course, for so many years, CBS was accused of putting its finger firmly on the Democratic side of the scale. And I wondered if you felt like at all that you were in the place of the people who had always accused CBS of being Democrats.
Well, some of that. But this is a complicated situation in this sense, that you have the corporate entity, that's CBS and Viacom, and you had CBS News. The tradition of CBS News, through Edward R. Murrow, right through Cronkite, and for a long time when I was there, was that there was a wall, a separation of the news division from the corporate entity. I wouldn't want to make this comparison too strong, but in the same way we talk about a wall between church and state for our overall nation. That began to melt away with the constant consolidation and mergers that made CBS News a part of a much larger conglomerate and eventually under Mr. Sumner Redstone. That what you say is true, that when you cover stories like the civil rights story and Dr. Martin Luther King in the early stages, Vietnam, Watergate, people who don't like what you report are going to try to hang a sign around you. And people on the right side of the political spectrum would hang the sign around CBS News and therefore around me as, they and he are a socialist, a communist, a bombshell-throwing Bolshevik or something. Never reminding people that we and I had a lot of trouble with Lyndon Johnson during his presidency, a Democrat. Jimmy Carter hated the interview I did with him because he graded himself. That here's the point, that people such as myself, having said I make my mistakes, I have had my failures, but my whole life has been dedicated to trying to be an honest broker of information. I pride my independence professionally above almost anything else. And I've always subscribed to the notion that you should pull no punches, play no favorites, be independent, fiercely independent when you had to, and know that you're going to take heat for that. There's going to be a price to pay. That if you do controversial stories, you're going to have to face the furnace and take the heat. I did that over a whole career. CBS News, for most of its long and storied tradition, did the same thing. What began to change near the end when I was there was the wall between the news division and the corporate entity crumbled. And Mr. Redstone had very important legislation and regulation in Washington he wanted to get through for his business interest. He announced, listen, I want George Bush to get elected. When it turned out that his reporters in the news division had done some deep digging, no joy in it. Nobody had anything against George Bush and saying, listen, he's commander-in-chief of the country. He's running 2 wars. Let's look at his record during the Vietnam War. And that's when everything hit the fan.
And you make the case that it's getting very difficult to do investigative journalism, period. And some of that, you make the case about the corporate pressures, but of course the biggest corporate pressure these days is no money.
Exactly?
And so the resources are not there to do this kind of work.
Well,
I was so struck by how long it took for your team to put together any stories like these great big stories. They take months to years. And who's got the money to have a team in the field like that anymore?
Well, this is the core point, and it's one of the things I don't dwell on it, but try to drive home in rather Unspoken, that deep digging investigative reporting is, number one, expensive. Number two, it's time consuming. That leads to it being costly. It also, quote, causes trouble if you're part of the corporate entity. So increasingly, investigative reporting has been strangled. That a local station, television station, may have had an investigative team. That's the first thing they cut. At the networks and up and down the dial. It's going out of fashion to do this kind of investigative reporting. And part of it is the corporatization of news. Part of it are the economic pressures that result from that, but also a part of it, and we have to face this, and I think it's important for the public at large to understand. Part of it is that those of us who are in journalism, I do not accept myself from this criticism. In many ways, we've lost our guts. We've lost our courage. We've lost our spine. Because increasingly, that if you do what I call deep digging investigative reporting, if you find out things that are important for people to know, but that some people, usually people in high, powerful places, don't want the public to know, one of the techniques they use is to attack you with a misinformation, flood the internet with things that aren't true, but with the idea that if you just bring a tsunami of misinformation and charges, that the truth will never catch up with it. And in the process, you, the reporter, will have a sign hung around you of unpatriotic, doesn't support the troops, socialists, communists, whatever. And as a result of that, there are very few places in the country now that practice on a sustained basis really hard-nosed, tough investigative reporting.
Well, and the internet, has brought us tremendous amount of benefit in terms of being able to get material that you were never able to get before. But it does have this other effect, and you certainly felt that. You suddenly discovered that there was this thing out there that was this enormous force.
Well, we discovered there was this thing out there that could be orchestrated and could be manipulated, if you will, for purposes. But this not only applies to what we call high-profile people, such as people on television, that I'm a great believer in the internet. I think it's a tremendous plus, and going forward, be nothing but, well, I can say nothing, a great plus. However, that if your neighbor gets mad at you these days and says, I'm going to get even with that Cokie Roberts, and starts putting out really nasty, scurrilous stuff on the internet anonymously, it's almost impossible to find out. Number one, almost impossible to find out who's doing it. And two, before you can even respond, you've been overwhelmed by these accusations which may stick with you for a lifetime. That's the downside of the internet. It is a mixed blessing, but I want to emphasize that I think overall in the main, it's more weighted to the positive side than negative.
It's always a good idea to invite the neighbor to the party. So you do go back to your childhood on the wrong side of the tracks in Houston, with your dad as a pipe layer, and your mom doing some hairdressing, taking in sewing, but inspiring you all along. And you had a couple of rough years with rheumatic fever, lying in bed listening to CBS radio. And then you grew up and found yourself in the same building with Charles Collingwood and Eric Sevareid. It must have been just like a dream come true.
It was walking a dream for me. That I was one of the lucky ones. I dreamed since childhood when we played those games. What do you want to be when you grow up? I always said I wanted to be a reporter. There was always some kid who wanted to be an airplane pilot, another wanted to be an Indian chief. I always said be a reporter. But in my time and place in my early youth, that meant being a print reporter. So that's what I aspired to be. But when I was bedridden with rheumatic fever for 3.5 going on 4 years, between ages of about 10.5 and 13.5 or so, these were the war years, World War II years. And I listened to the great voices of Ed Murrow, Eric Sevareid, Charles Collingwood. I know for younger people in the audience, these are names long since forgotten.
That's all right. There are not that many of them, and they might as well look them up.
But, when I started Cokie, and I think it was the same with you, there was no template. There was no expectation of making a lot of money or having being a celebrity or your name in print or anything. It was you had to love the news, and I loved covering news. But when the great Hurricane Carla, came in 1961, our coverage was picked up at the network, and the next thing he hired me. It was...
At this point, you were at a television station in Houston.
That's right. But when I got to CBS News, to what I always referred to as the cathedral of broadcast journalism, it was like walking a dream. I walked the halls with legends, some of whom you mentioned. But it also did something else to me, two things. One, I realized that I was going to have to get better. I was going to have to get a lot better if I was to stick in the kind of conceit and arrogance that only probably a male young reporter can have. I thought I was a pretty good writer. I thought I was a pretty good broadcaster. But number one, I thought I was an referee in a game. Number two, my first regular assignment for CBS News was covering Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. That 1962 to 1964, that changed me as a pro, and it changed me as a person.
And you know, I think people forget how hard that was in terms of journalism, and how in that era there was a lot of pressure on the people at the top at the network to pull you off or pull off those reporters who were covering what was going on and showing the world fire hoses and dogs and all of those things that were happening.
That is true. And the corporate ownership and management at that time resisted those calls. Some southern stations refused to carry the CBS Evening News or parts of the news because we were showing violence against peaceful protesters. And when I say that coverage experience changed me as a pro and as a person, although I grew up in Texas, which was a segregated society, I had never seen a Ku Klux Klan rally. When I saw one, chills went through me. But I can only imagine, I said, if it's causing that reaction in you, how must it make these African-American people feel? I would not have believed until I saw it or witnessed to it that police and a city government would turn high-pressure fire hoses on women and children who were peacefully demonstrating and turn vicious dogs on them. Now, this eventually made an impact throughout the network. I think it eventually had an impact throughout the country. But when these southern stations, who were CBS affiliates, would call the corporate management and say, if you continue to have that well-known communist Dan Rather down here telling these lies to people about what we're doing, we're not going to be affiliated with you. And the corporate management and ownership, they had spine. They stood tall during that period and said, you do what you want, but we're going to continue to cover this story. And by the way, if you pull your affiliation, we'll go across the street with the station across the street. But they stood strong in that. And part of it was because William S. Paley, who headed CBS corporate at that time, he was a businessman. He wanted to make money, and he made a lot of money. But he saw news as a public trust. And he wanted to meet the responsibilities of that trust. He saw news as a public service. Yes, if you can make some money with it, that's fine. But that's not the main purpose. The main purpose is we're going to contribute to the public service. Now, fair to say there was some pressure on him from the FCC and others, but that complicates the story. But while I don't dwell on it, I talk about this in the book and how things have changed from that era.
You even had stations sabotaging your film.
Yes, it was very common. It's easy to dramatize what reporters such as myself went through. We were in danger a good deal of the time. There were reporters killed covering the civil rights movement. There were beatings. But it was nothing compared to what people of color were going through. Nothing to compare with that. But there was that sabotaging of our film. There were stations that wouldn't carry our newscast. There were signs in places like motels that would say, no inns or reporters allowed. But it was part of my midlife early education in news, and a good lesson was learned.
And in that period, President Kennedy went to Dallas, basically launching his re-election campaign, and you knew Dallas well, and CBS sent you there.
They did. Because I was a Texan, I was covering the civil rights movement, they called and said, listen, you know Texas, and President Kennedy is going to Texas for what was described as a rather routine campaign tour of the state, getting ready for the 1964 elections. So I did go to Texas, I did set up our coverage, and I was in Dallas the day he was shot.
On the grassy knoll, the famous grassy knoll.
Just beyond it, the grassy knoll, railroad tracks, the knoll goes down on the other side, and I was there. I did not see the shooting, I did not hear the shots.
But you called the hospital.
I did. When the motorcade whizzed by, and it was something strange. It just in a few seconds whizzed by, and I thought it took a wrong turn, and the rest of the motorcade didn't come. I said, there's something wrong here. So I said, I better hot foot back to the station, which was a few blocks away. But when I sort of topped the grassy knoll and saw that chaotic scene of fathers putting their bodies on top of their children, people screaming and pointing, I said, I'm out of position here. I got to get back to the station. But when I got back to the station, I did call the hospital, and that and Eddie Barker, a very good reporter in Dallas, knew somebody in the hospital staff. We established that he was dead.
Before it was announced by anybody.
Before it was announced officially. And it doesn't amount to a whole lot, but we broke the story. That is to say, not only has the president been shot at, if you'll pardon that syntax, but he's been shot, and not only has been shot and severely wounded, he's dead. We did report that story. And then
you talked to a priest who was at the hospital.
We did. Well, what we had was doctor, priest, a high-ranking man on the board, all of whom just said flatly, he's dead. Now, I worked an apprenticeship on the police beat in Houston when I was a beginning reporter, and said to myself, listen, if you have a doctor or a priest and either the chairman or vice chairman of the hospital board telling you he's dead, what you have is a dead man.
And then you went on to Washington, and there was a Texan as president, yes. But you didn't get to stay there.
No, that I was there for the year 1964, which was a campaign year, and covered the campaign, and then was transferred to London as head of a London bureau. But the Vietnam War was, anybody with any experience knew it was becoming a big story. I wanted to go, I asked to go, and was eventually sent to Vietnam and spent almost a year there on my first trip. I was back another 3 times after that.
And that experience also sort of got you in hot water from time to time with the powers that be.
Well, the powers that be in this case were the powers that be in Washington.
Right.
Because while it wasn't clear to nearly everybody at the time, it's now clear that what you had is those in power in Washington, both Republican and Democratic, but Lyndon Johnson was president. They wanted the American people to believe that the war was going well. They wanted one image of the war. For those of us who covered the war, and I will say, particularly for those of us in television, because you have to go there to get the pictures.
Right.
We were reporting the reality of the war, which when I was there the first time, the reality was it was at best a stalemate. It wasn't that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were winning, but we weren't winning. But when you report from the field, and you're saying in I Corps in South Vietnam, the situation it's fragile at best from our point of view. And in Washington, the President and Secretary of Defense are saying, things are really going well. We're stacking up Viet Cong bodies higher than your head. War's going well. The 2 versions of the war. And yes, that will get you in trouble with power, and we had trouble with them.
And then you came back here, and Richard Nixon was president, and there was Watergate.
Yes. I came back near the end of the Johnson administration, and Richard Nixon won the 1968 election right. And came in as president. And, well, as the rest is history. But with Watergate, it's one word, a shorthand word we use, and I think we need to remind ourselves from time to time what Watergate was. This was a widespread criminal conspiracy, Unfortunately, and it still sort of sticks in my throat to have to say it, led in large part out of the Oval Office by a president of the United States who became the only president to resign, and he resigned as what the grand jury called an unindicted co-conspirator in this criminal conspiracy. And certainly during that period, there was a lot of pressure on CBS, and there was a lot of pressure on me and other correspondents who were covering it. I was the chief White House correspondent, so perhaps a little more of it was directed at me.
And at one point in a press conference, you stand up, and there's some cheers and boos. I mean, you were a lightning rod for some of this. President says to you, "Are you running for something, Mr. Rather?" And you said, "No, sir, are you, Mr. President?" And
that's true.
And that got a lot of flack.
Well, it did, and perhaps it should have, but you mentioned lightning rod. I never set out to be a lightning rod. I never wanted to be a lightning rod. But when you cover controversial stories, the civil rights movement, yes, the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, and the early stages of Watergate, whether you want it or not, you become a lightning rod. Now, what happened at that particular news conference in Houston, and for anybody who's interested, I'm not suggesting you should be, this is in the book, but in short, the noose was tightening on President Nixon. The special prosecutor's investigation was finding all kinds of eyewitness and ear witness testimony and documents to lay out some facts. The president was trying to get people to believe, don't be confused by those facts, the special prosecutor, this is my story. So it was all kind of coming down. They wanted a kind of pep rally for the president in Houston, and the centerpiece was to be a press conference. Some of us in the White House press corps, including but not only myself, said this is not a good idea. But it wound up, we were on stage in a big arena, and I knew
with a live audience.
With a live audience. They had tried to paper the House. That's not a crime to make it look good for the president. But I knew from previous experience at news conferences that President Nixon, whatever else you may think of him, he was intelligent and he was sharp. And one of the techniques he used, if you got up at a press conference and he thought you were going to ask a tough question based on his previous experience, he always tried to jab you a little bit, try to knock you off balance, just cause you to get a little unsettled. He'd done it several times before. For example, out in California once I got up to ask a question. They had tried to, John Ehrlichman had in effect tried to bribe a federal judge having to do with the Nixon case. So I rose at the news conference. This was before Houston, and said, Mr. President, I want to ask this question directly, but I also want to ask it respectfully. He interjected. He said, that would be unusual. But at any rate, I didn't want to embarrass anybody. I didn't want to be embarrassed myself. I wanted to get on to the question, which had to do with, Mr. President, what you're saying is at variance with what the special prosecutor is saying. Can you please explain? Nobody remembers the question. They just remember this little tete-a-tete at first.
But you thought that might be part of the reason that when President Ford became president, CBS said, why don't you leave the White House now and come do CBS reports?
I did then and I do now. I think that was one of the reasons. In fairness, Dick Salant, who was president of CBS News at the time, flatly denied it, said that was not the case. But I did move on after covering the Ford administration for a while to a new job in New York.
Yes, a news job in New York, which led to being the anchor of the CBS Evening News.
Yes.
Right.
First led to 60 Minutes,
right.
And then led, yes.
So, and of course, in that capacity, you had the famous interview with President George Bush the First.
True. Right,
where I remember I was in the radio TV gallery in the House of Representatives that day watching, and I thought, ooh, this is not going well.
And you were right.
And I remember analyzing it, that Bush had de-wimpified himself was his kind of goal in that interview, and you think he was all ready for it with cue cards at the ready.
Well, I think that is true. They had the cue cards at the ready. And again, this is the way politics is played, certainly at or near the top. That he was vice president at that time. He'd been involved in the Iran-Contra thing, which as a constitutional crisis was on a par, I think, with Watergate.
Oh, I think worse, actually.
Maybe even worse. But nonetheless, he didn't want to answer questions about that because he had misled people to a certain degree about what his involvement was and wasn't. But the technique always is, listen, if you don't like the facts, if you don't like the question, try to change the focus. And Roger Ailes, who later became famous as the head of Fox News, was his political advisor. And Ailes, it wasn't, I think, he held up cue cards. When I asked him about Iran-Contra, Ailes held up a cue card, asked him about black air in Miami. It was another case where I'd got myself in some trouble. As a way of changing the subject, I would respectfully disagree about one thing. The legend that the first President Bush and his people always tried to spread is that de-wimpified him, that he had a reputation of being a bit of a wimp. And by taking on Dan Rather, this arch enemy of everything good and decent, truth and justice in the United States. But interesting enough, after that interview, he lost the Iowa caucuses. He was running for president.
To Pat Robertson.
Right. He had been leading, and he lost. He finished third. He came back in New Hampshire. But I don't think first of all, I don't think most Americans ever considered him a wimp. I think that was overemphasized, and he wasn't. and I don't think that the interview de-wimpified him. But it was not one of my most happy moments.
Well, because you can't win in a situation like that. You know, when you're interviewing a president or a candidate or anybody important, and you're trying to get them to answer the question, after a certain point you look like the bad guy. And you sort of hope that the viewer, listener will say, okay, he's not answering the question, and that the questioner is really standing in my stead. But it's a problem. They start to say, stop beating up on him, it's not looking
Well,
nice.
one reason, you and I may disagree about this. I think most of the public gets it when that happens. You said, well, one of the reasons some reporters, and I've done it myself, don't ask the tough questions. You say, listen, you ask that tough question, you follow up on the tough question, there's going to be hell to pay. The hell is going to be that the political person, whether he be Democrat or Republican, he's going to turn his operation to try to make you look like the bad guy. But my experience, Cokie, and I'd be surprised if it isn't yours, the audience gets it. If you
by and large, it's sort of depends. And I think you can kind of do it 3 times, and by the 3rd time, you hope the audience just knows they have.
Well, exactly. And sometimes only 2.
That's right. Sometimes only 2. Well, we're about to come to the audience for your questions, and there are microphones on either side. And I'm afraid you really must get up and go to the microphone because we are at the National Archives, and everything is archived. So you need to stand in front of a microphone so you can be recorded. As you're getting to the microphones, I just want to say one last thing, which is that there is a hero in this book, and that is Jean Rather. All these years that you were doing all of these things that were exciting or dangerous or whatever, she was there. Keeping the home fires going, raising 2 great kids, and telling and giving you support with what you were doing.
Well, amen to all of that. And when I took the dedication to Rather Outspoken to the publisher, he gulped and said, our dedications are usually 2 or 3 lines at most. This is about 1.5 pages. And I said, well, I feel strongly about having it in the book. He gulped and said, well, perhaps we could put it in the back part of the book. And I understood that, but I said no. And I would say if somebody reads only one part of the book, I hope it'll be that 1.5 pages because she deserves it.
But she shows up in lots of other pages too. I've read the book, and there are places where you are in a situation, and she says, "I'm with you. You do what you have to do. I love you."
Well, that is true. And Cokie, if you offer me Anchorman indulgence, I will tell you a story, which, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, this story has the added advantage of being true. I understand some other people have adopted it, but this happened. After I succeeded Walter Cronkite as anchor and managing editor of CBS News, nobody replaces Walter Cronkite. I succeeded him. I had been told the ratings would go down and maybe stay down for a couple of years, then maybe come back. Primarily, that didn't happen. We had a very good 2.5 years, almost right off the bat. And to be candid about it, I got a little big-headed. I'm sure this never happens with your husband, but in Jean Rather's household, I got a little big-headed. And Jean Rather said to me, Dan, you're getting too conceited even for me. So we need to go home to Texas. For the Rathers, going home to Texas is a cure-all, like going to the hot springs in Arkansas. So Jean is from Winchester, Texas, which is in the rural part of the state. If you haven't heard of it, no embarrassment, because it's a village of 35 people, 20 of whom are Jean's family.
But the others probably are, too. They just haven't admitted it.
But we fly to Austin, we rent a car, and we begin driving out to this rural area. And first it's a 4-lane highway, then a 2-lane highway, and then a 2-lane blacktop. And at a certain point, the 2-lane blacktop leads into a gravel road. And the gravel road leads to a dirt road, and in the dirt road, that's where Winchester is. Anyway, we get to the airport, we get in the car, it's one of those scorching hot Texas days. We drive at the place where the 2-lane blacktop leads into the gravel road. There was a new combination service station and convenience store, 7-Eleven kind of store. Right. Jean saw it, said, this is new, why don't you stop and we get a cold Dr. Pepper. you stay in the car, I'll go inside. She did. She stayed an inordinate amount of time. I kept looking at my watch and saying, what's going on in there? Finally looked up, and through the plate glass window in the front, there was Jean Rather engaged in a very animated conversation with a man about her age. She stayed in a total of about 18 to 20 minutes. That's a long time.
Yeah, for the quick stop, right.
She got back in the car, as husbands are prone to do. I made 2 mistakes. First mistake I made was I said, Gene, you stayed in there almost 20 minutes, and I saw you having this animated conversation with the guy. And I'm not going to use a real name, but she said, oh, Dan, that's Luther Zimmerhansel, and I went with him in high school, and he's just bought this new service station and convenience store out here, and so I wanted to talk about. Then I made my second mistake. I said, well, you know, Gene, if things had gone a certain way, if things had turned a certain way, you might be out here helping Luther operate this filling station convenience store. And don't you know, her eyes never left mine. She said, no, Dan, you don't understand. If I had married Luther, he would be the anchor and managing editor of the studio.
So, go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you for coming. This is Living History. My wife and I, on our way from California to Rhode Island, did not expect this.
Oh, good.
And it's a great pleasure.
Welcome to the archives. Now you can tell everybody this is a fabulous place. Where this
we will do so. We also were able to stop in Houston for a couple of days with family and New Orleans in a couple of days with friends, and we'd never been either place, and we see that they produce such wonderful people. Well, my wife and I have a lot of time to talk while we're driving from California to Rhode Island, and we wonder whether both of you might speak a little about how you think things are going and whether we're at a point that is different and more acrimonious than the past or not, and where we're headed.
Why don't you lead off?
This is your show, Dan. I do think we're in an acrimonious period. It's a very long answer, and I write history books, so I don't think it's the most acrimonious period. People are not shooting each other, and that's a plus. And they used to. I mean, you know, the Burr-Hamilton duel was just the most famous, but they used to call each other out on the floor of the House of Representatives and go to Bladensburg and shoot each other on the dueling ground. So that's an improved. Metal detectors, yes, but yes, it is an acrimonious time for all kinds of reasons.
Well, absolutely, but I want to add, let's remind ourselves, we're Americans. Almost without exception, we love our country. And we're very good at adjusting. America is the best society in world history at adjusting. We'll get through this period. I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. It is an especially acrimonious period. There's far too much acrimony. And in a Texas phrase, you ain't seen nothing yet before we get through this presidential campaign. But one of Ed Murrow's favorite words was steady. And if we just steady as we go, we'll get through this period. And I honestly believe, I read these articles about how America's time has passed, how it's decline of empire. It's not that I'm trying to be one of those people who avoids the facts. I really think that the best days of this country are ahead of us, and I hope I live long enough to see some of them.
No, I agree.
Hello, Mr. Rather. Saw you last night at the synagogue. Hello again. You mentioned how business interests affect what's covered on the news. What do you consider personally to be the story that is most unreported these days that you really wish was reported?
I don't have to think long on that. I think the most unreported story in a presidential election campaign, it's going to cost $3 billion. The most underreported story is who gives what money to whom, expecting to get what, and then check the record after the election. Do they get what they thought they were buying during the campaign?
You know, one of the interesting things that's happened is with the super PACs that have come about as a result of the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, is that we had expected a lot of corporate and labor union money to go into those. And that is happening. But the real money that's going in is individual donors, high-end net worth individuals. And a lot of that has to do with branding, that a corporation doesn't want its name associated with this, but an individual has much less exposure.
But the Supreme Court decision, again, however one feels about it, likes it or doesn't like it, does increase the possibility, in some cases, the probability of being able to contribute the money, and nobody can ever know where the money came from.
Well, eventually, you actually do have to report, but it's eventually, so it could be after the election.
But your point is well taken.
Yeah.
That so far and up to now,
Yeah.
The big contributors to the super money are what is known in Texas as, quote, unit players. A unit player in political speak in Texas is someone who's ready to pop out with $1 million or more with one phone call.
Yeah, it's been a phenomenon that we didn't expect particularly. Go ahead.
Mr. Rather, there seems to be abundant evidence that the Bush campaign engaged in misdirection in both the year 2000 as well as 2004 to distract attention from George W. Bush's Air National Guard experience, which can only be described as underwhelming. As a reporter, what kind of an obligation did you feel to investigate these campaigns of misdirection, you or maybe some of your producers at CBS?
Well, that's what got us in trouble. That we did investigate. And you say obligation, I think it's an apt word in some ways, but I think most people understand it. But by and large, straight reporters trying to be honest brokers of information, such as myself, we don't have an agenda. It's not that we want one side to get elected and another side. What we care about is the story. And any way you look at it, if you have a commander-in-chief who is commanding 2 overseas wars, what he did and didn't do when it was his time to serve, that's a story. And if it turns out that he avoided going to a combat area through the influence of his father, got in the so-called Champagne unit, and then disappeared while he was supposed to be on duty for a year. Whether he was a Democrat or Republican, that's a story. And you mentioned where we got in trouble was the misdirection. The story was true. Whatever one thinks about how we arrived at that, the story was true, remains true to this day. Therefore, the misdirection, what I call the misinformation campaign, the camouflage, it was, listen, they've got the story. We have to change the subject. We can't let the narrative become what he did or didn't do. And say, you said, well, what did we do?
So they changed it to the question of the documents, you're saying?
Well, exactly. They changed it to the process. They never denied the story. President Bush has never denied the truth of the story, but they said, in effect, what their position is, yes, the story is true, but you know what?
Well, they haven't said that.
No, they haven't said, well, Bartlett, when we interviewed him, this is deep in the weeds, I understand, but when we took the story to the White House, and the principal spokesman for the president showed it to me, and he said, we said, is that true? And he said, it's old news.
Old news.
Yeah. But
It's
nonetheless, let me get back to the main point.
up.
Look, I do not, again, I don't accept myself in this criticism. That too often that we don't look into these kinds of things, the misdirection. Mind you, the Democrats can do a lot of misdirection of their own. It's in the nature of politics. But journalism at its best serves as a check and balance on power. And our job is, when they're doing that kind of thing, to find it out. Sometimes we don't, sometimes we fail. In the case of this particular story, I think we succeeded, but we paid a big price for it.
I live down in South Carolina, and I'm a lifelong partisan of CBS News. When Edward R. Murrah said good night and good luck, my old daddy turned off the radio, and that was when we all went to bed. And I watched Douglas Edwards and Walter Cronkite, and when you came along, Mr. Rather, we were all gratified that finally there was an anchorman without an accent. And you, Ms. Roberts, I haven't seen you since I stood behind the Lady Bird special in 1964, and frankly, I don't remember seeing you then. But I have a vivid.
But my parents were
I have a vivid recollection burned into my brain of your old daddy standing on the back of that train, and I recall it often.
I actually just sent off to the LBJ Library all of my mother's, I live in the house I grew up in. And I found all of my mother's documents from the Lady Bird Special. Documents meaning the backs of laundry slips. But it was entirely a female political operation.
Mrs. Olin Johnston worked hard on that.
Right.
I was going to say that what CBS did to you in 2004 was a disgrace and a forfeiture of the great Edward R. Murrah tradition. It is a
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Having made a serious comment, I was going to ask a serious question, but we're all Southerners here, and Southerners love storytelling. And I haven't read the new book, but I read The Camera Never Blinks.
Okay,
God bless you for that.
We really don't tell a story. We'd love to hear your story later.
No, it's not mine. It's Mr. Rather's. I was going to see if you'd tell that story about when LBJ got after you when you had that big recording device and you had to hide behind a tree down at the LBJ
That's
Library.
true. Thank you very much.
Over here.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rather, Ms. Roberts, it's an unexpected pleasure to see both of you here today. We weren't expecting this. And I actually, Mr. Rather, had the pleasure of having breakfast with you 30-some years ago at Radcliffe College in a small setting. I was just finishing up college, and I'm wondering now what advice you'd have to somebody just coming out of college wanting to go into reporting. What advice would you give them?
Run.
Thank you.
Well, I think it is to remind yourself what you already know, and that is that writing is the bedrock of the craft. Anything in journalism, any hope of succeeding in any form of journalism, not just print, radio, or television, begins with writing. So I would say remember that and commit yourself to a lifetime of striving, ever striving to become a better writer. Because if you can write, particularly if you can write clearly and concisely and fairly swiftly, I can't guarantee that you're going to be famous or make a lot of money, but you'll be employable.
First, before I ask my question, I got to tell them background a little bit. I come from more of a military family, enlisted military, of course, and my father and uncle were both Vietnam, and my uncle was in their 70, 71. My father was there in 68, and he was wounded in 68 and came home, and he died shortly afterwards of cancer. Can you tell me your experience with dealing with Agent Orange or reporting on it?
Thank you for the question. And I trust everybody in the audience knows what Agent Orange is and was. This is a highly toxic chemical defoliant. And in the early stages of the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, it was seen as, quote, a very effective weapon. You can imagine why the Pentagon thought it was that, because the Air Force and other planes could fly fairly low over jungle areas and defoliate, that is, make the trees disappear fairly quickly, so the enemy would have no place to hide. As coincidence would have it, that's a story that we broke on CBS News, which is to say we had the first report and the first pictures a long time ago of the Air Force plane spraying this stuff out. And I remember being on that plane ride. Now, since then, there are many, the Pentagon and the government, both Republican and Democrat, acknowledge that this had a terrible effect on humans, and including some of our own service people. There's always been some question in my mind about how many people in the service, and both diplomatic and military, suffer from this. My own opinion, please underscore this, italicize it, that the numbers have been underestimated. But what we do know is that many thousands of veterans of the Vietnam War suffered having been under this Agent Orange, even in adjacent areas, and we're still trying to find out just how many of them suffered. Many of them died from it. We don't know the total numbers. Thank you for the question.
We have time for one more question, so if anybody else is in line.
Yeah, I'm from Houston, Mr. Rather. I want to thank you for your coverage of Hurricane Carter in the 60s.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering if you knew anything about Kennedy, whether JFK wanted to wage war in Vietnam. Do you have any about that?
Did what with Vietnam?
Whether Kennedy wanted to pull out of Vietnam.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Yes.
Totally. again, and I thought I'd turn this phone off, and I'm very sorry for that. I apologize. No, I apologize. Look, it's one of those questions like might have, could have, should have, maybe, if. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought is President Kennedy would certainly have pulled out of Vietnam if he had been reelected in 1964, and we would have escaped that whole nasty, ugly, terribly costly period. The other side of it says, wait a minute. It was President Eisenhower had refused to put an American military presence on the ground in Vietnam or anyplace else in Southeast Asia, because the old general said fighting a land war on Asia is not in our best interest. But President Kennedy came in, reassessed the situation. A general named Maxwell Taylor convinced him that it was a mistake. Keep in mind, the Cold War was at or near its height at this time, and the belief was if the Soviet-supported communists took over South Vietnam, there'd be a domino effect, everybody else would go. And it was President Kennedy who authorized the first U.S. ground troops there and, quote, escalated the war, if you will. He took it was first to be, I think, 2,500 to begin with, then 5,000, then eventually 15,000. So if you look at the record, just a cold look at the record, there's no indication that President Kennedy had any second thoughts about Vietnam or was thinking about doing something else in his second term. And also President Kennedy was a highly competitive person. Anybody who plays politics at that level is highly competitive. So bottom line, we'll never know. You look at the two arguments and take your choice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So Dan is going to be signing his book, and there are many copies available for you to get signed. This is a moment in history for all of you. So thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.